if you were to compile a list of the most controversial passages in all the Bible, that would actually be a good little Bible study series. Get them all out. Here's 6 weeks, we're going to get in trouble, and then we're going to move on. This would rank top 2 or 3, and I would have to sit and think about what may trump it. But this is certainly a difficult passage. There's some assaults in Genesis and Samuel that you would probably put up there, one by Judah and others. But this is a hard one. I'll say that I am a father, and I am a father of a little girl. So this is a hard one. I'm also a human being. You don't need to be a dad, and you don't need to have kids. We're human beings. And as we get through this, I think it would be best for us to wrestle with our struggle with this text. And actually, as we've said, I think that's part of it, is the Bible is honest about the human condition, human emotions, and how sometimes there isn't an easy answer to what we do, why we do it, or even why God allows it. And so even though we shy away from these passages, I do think it's good for us to talk about it as a church. So Judges chapter 11, verses 34 to 40, instead of just reading through as we normally do, I think it'd be best if we just sort of walk through it together. We actually introduced this last week, and so I want to review some of that. Remember, we are looking at the heroes of Judges, and they get progressively worse. So you start with Othniel, that name will be on your quiz at the end, and then you end with Samson. And you can see they just get worse. Othniel was a hero. He was a great guy, military dude. He led well. And then they just get more violent. They get more pagan, literally. And Jephthah's a good example of this. And so what we did is we had Gideon, who started out really well. And by the end, he had multiple wives, dozens of children. He sort of set himself up as a demi-king. And then his son, Abimelech, tried to make himself king. He was an awful human being, killed his own brothers, right? And this is the guy who's supposed to lead Israel. And then if that wasn't bad, we get a comparable man by the name of Jephthah. And Jephthah is not a good human being. Yet he is raised up in Israel to deliver Israel. Now you remember that the story of Jephthah, we're introduced with the major question, and it's very important we don't forget this is the big idea. Can we reach a point where God has had enough and he will not deliver sinners? That's the big issue of Jephthah, because initially it seemed like God said, I've had enough with you. You've gone too far. You're on your own. And yet, when you turn into chapter 11, Jephthah is raised up. Now remember, Jephthah is the son of a harlot. He's the son of a prostitute. He is exiled from his home by his brothers, and he becomes the leader of bandits. A pirate, a marauder, whatever term you want to use. So he's going around, he's killing and stealing from his own countrymen. And when the Ammonites rise against Israel, he is chosen, due to the lack of options, to defend Israel. And he's only willing to do it if they give him power after he gains a victory. So in verses 29 to 31, we won't read it because we talked about it last week, he makes the vow. He comes to God, a God I don't think he really believes in. I think it's syncretistic. He's got, the big G God, but he's bought into all the Canaanite gods. So he comes to the big G God and he says, I tell you what, if you give me this victory, let's make a deal. You give me victory, I give you whoever, or your translation probably says whatever, comes out of my front door when I return home victorious. Now, we talked about that last week. A better translation would probably be whoever, because pets don't run out to greet you. Even now, your cat ain't doing it, because your cat couldn't care less when you get home, okay? Let's be honest, cats are awful. Your dog is perfectly fine waiting until you come in the house, So now, our dog will run in the house to greet me. That's faux show, okay? But so I think he's well aware someone's coming out here. If I had to give him the benefit of a doubt, I suspect he thinks it's going to be a servant girl. Because we talked about this last week, that when you come home victorious, the women of all the women come out and greet the soldiers. We do parades, something like that, okay? And we have stories. Miriam did that, and the other women when they crossed the Red Sea. And you remember David's wife didn't like David was, dancing. What you have are the women coming out, blowing trumpets, dancing. They got tambourines. So we know that we expect at least a woman to come out. And if I give him the benefit of the doubt, I suspect he's thinking a servant girl. So he makes a vow, whoever comes out or whatever comes out, I will offer as a sacrifice to you. And immediately we are appalled. To even make the vow says something about his heart. Well, he gets the victory. We saw that last week, going all the way down in verse 33. He struck them from this town to that town, 20 cities. He gains a big victory. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. So he gains the victory. He won. Yay. Starting verse 34 to 40 is the awful part. We've got to spend a whole week on it, okay? So let's start here in verse 34. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. One of the things that's important to note in reading this is there is the narrative and there is the way the narrative is given. When you read, that is important. There is the story broadly given, but there's also the tone and the motivation of the one telling the story. So read this again, and you got to ask yourself, what is the perspective of the narrator? Is he just a journalist telling a story? This is what happened. Or is he really saying, I think if you read this, he says, Jephthah comes home, and his daughter comes out. His only child. He had no children. I think you can really see that the perspective of the narrator is to say, this is an awful thing, and it needs to be acknowledged as an awful thing. So we are like, oh no, it's the daughter. So he comes home victorious, and everyone is exuberant. They welcome him. And so there's nothing surprising in the sense that that the women come out, particularly his daughter comes. That's not surprising, but it is shocking when we know the vow that he just made. Now, this phrase, only child, my translation says only child, it is literally in the Hebrew, one and only child. Now, some time ago, we went through the book of Genesis. It took us about 28 years to do it. And you may remember that there's a story in there where Abraham is commanded by God to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Now, it doesn't happen because, the angel of the Lord comes down and a ram is provided, all that sort of stuff. We can't rehash that. However, the story is written in such a way that we are to naturally hearken back to that story. So let me throw it up here just to sort of show you this point, that we can compare and contrast these two stories. So here's Abraham on the left, Jephthah on the right. Abraham's story is to test the commitment of Abraham, whereas here the test is to test the commitment of God. So God orders Abraham to do something, to test him out in the wilderness. We've talked about that. Jephthah is testing God. Will you be faithful to us? And he thinks, well, you'll only be faithful to us if I do something this drastic. That's a pagan way of thinking. Abraham is the father of promise. He is called from his home. Remember, he goes from Ur and eventually ends up in Canaan. Jephthah is the son of a harlot who is called, he's cast from his home. He's kicked out. So you see the contrast. Abraham is saintly, though flawed, let's be honest. He's not perfect by any stretch. I think you read Jephthah, I think he's pagan. I think he's largely pagan. His practices are pagan. The way he talks is pagan. What he does is pagan. And this is the climax of that. As we'll see, Israel, God is appalled by human sacrifice. Virtually every pagan culture throughout history had no problem with human sacrifice. Where you find paganism, however you define it, you'll find human sacrifice in some form. So it's interesting, in the story of Abraham, his son, we know his name, Isaac. Here, we're never given the name of his daughter. That almost heightens the tragedy of it. She's not even given a name. Because to him, she is the means to his ends. If I have to sacrifice a daughter to protect my people, I'll do it. But I have to have victory. I have to be welcomed back with open arms to the people who cast me out. It's really tragic. The phrase one and only child is in both passages. Isaac is loved by his father. We are never told that Jephthah loves his daughter. Now, there's some emotion there. He's heartbroken when she comes out at first, but beyond, we're never told really their relationship. Isaac is accompanied by his father up the mountain. Remember, he asked, hey, Dad, we got the wood and knife and stuff. Where's the sacrifice? You remember, Abraham says, God will provide the lamb. And, of course, I think he did that in Jesus. Here, the daughter goes off, and they meet at the place of sacrifice. They remain separate in this whole story. The only time they're together is when she comes out to greet him. They are separate the rest of the time. In Abraham, it's a male victim. In Jephthah, it's a female victim. And I actually think that makes it worse because when you have godlessness, women and children are always the victims. Always the victims. So it's not an accident you have a female victim here. The story of Abraham, you have interrupted by, that's supposed to be a big G. Sorry, that's a typo. I believe he goes through the sacrifice. That's one of the interpretive challenges. There's other views. We'll talk about them. And it's a reflection of God's silence. God stopped it with Isaac. Why didn't he stop it here? God's silent. Remember, when he made the vow, God never responds. He's silent in the whole story. In Abraham, it confirmed his faith. Here, it confirmed the faithlessness of Jephthah. It confirmed the presence of God with Abraham. It confirmed the absence of God with Jephthah. So we are to see these two stories pit against each other in many ways. And in verse 35, notice this. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You've become the cause of great trouble for me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. Now, there's some things to know here. One, his first reaction is to mourn. He tears his clothes. This is a common way. Here's a few examples from the Old Testament. We could give New Testament example of this. You would rip your clothes in periods of mourning or in presence of blasphemy. So when Jesus says, you'll see the Son of Man riding on the clouds, they rip their clothes to say this is blasphemy. But mostly in the Old Testament, it's used in the context of mourning. When Job loses his family, he rips his clothes, he sits in ashes. And you can see the other examples there. So when he sees his daughter comes out, his response is, oh no, and he rips his clothes. That is the last time he does anything worth saying it's somewhat good. Shouldn't be in the situation to begin with. But I want you to notice here how he blames his daughter for his own foolishness and rash vow. You brought me very low. You've become the cause of great trouble to me. Now, she's probably oblivious, as far as we know, oblivious of this vow. Oblivious. He didn't need to make the vow to begin with. Or, had he made the vow, he didn't have to include the part that might have included human sacrifice. He could have clearly said, Lord, if you give me this victory, much like the others who made vows, I will give you 100 cattle and sheep. I don't know, whatever it is. He could have made it very clear this would be an animal sacrifice, a burnt offering, consistent with the Mosaic law. Instead, he leaves it open to include his daughter. I want you to notice this is ego and this is victim blaming. It's very common. Is in order to make him not look bad, you've got to make other people look worse. And he's doing this. She's an innocent victim of his foolishness. The man who can lead armies cannot lead his own home. In that sense, he's like David. And this is a common tactic that you see all over the place. Now, I want to read Daniel Block's commentary here. I think he nails it, so let me just steal his work. Okay. Although the present story ends with the death of the young girl, so you see his conclusion there. Her father is the tragic figure. Now, that's saying something, isn't it? Because she is the tragic figure, presenting a pathetic picture of stupidity, brutality, ambition, and self-centeredness. Ironically, the one who appeared to have become master of his own fate, which is the whole story of Jephthah, has become a victim of his own rash word. The strong man of Tob, the conquering hero, was a captive in his own house. There is no sign of divine empowerment or spirit endowment as he seeks to extricate himself from his own foolish vow. Even his response to the appearance of his daughter, he could not get beyond his own personal welfare. He tore his clothes and exclaimed, "Oh," in grief, but despite his address of the girl as "my daughter" rather than her name, his grief was not for the death of this innocent maiden, but for himself. Far from displaying any hint of tenderness towards his daughter, the tone in this double-barrel reaction is accusatory. You have indeed driven me to my knees. You are responsible for my ruin, his translation. The irony of the scene is patent. The man who had tried to manipulate Yahweh, the Lord, to guarantee his peace is doomed by the one whose life he was willing to sacrifice for his own well-being. The last statement of verse 35 expresses tragic resignation. Jephthah had opened his mouth to God, so he cannot retract his words. This man who sought so desperately to be head and ruler of Israel was a victim of his own vow and of his daughter. That's a great summary of the first two verses we're looking at here today. I couldn't beat it, so I just read it to you. There you go. So verse 36. And she said to him, my father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out from your mouth. Now the Lord has avenged you on your enemies and on the Ammonites. Now the behavior, the character of the hero is contrasted with the gentleness and submissiveness of his daughter. Now, she should not submit to this. For one, it violates the Mosaic law. We'll get to that. However, we are to see a contrast here. He is rash. She is gentle. He is violent. She is... she's the complete opposite. She's a peacemaker. You know, what a contrast here. Now, they're both pagans, but what a contrast we have here. It heightens the tragedy of the scene. And she affectionately refers to him as my father. And she is submissive, even shockingly so. Do to me, she says, according to what has gone out of your mouth. She is theologically deep, acknowledging the Lord's victory, even above her father's hand in the victory. She credits victory to God, not to her father, all the while submitting herself to the father, even when he is in the wrong. It's just so tragic. So we find ourselves rooting for the victim here, don't we? We want to root for Jephthah. He's supposed to be one of the heroes of the story, and we find ourselves rooting for one of his victims. Yeah.
What's the Bible say about broken vows?
Well, here is an example where not only is it permissible, but you're obligated to break the vow. So the issue is the content of the vow. If you make a vow, keep it. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. Bearing false witness.
The lookup on vows, there's never any place that I read where you should break a vow.
Right, but this is an example where, so there are laws, but then there are laws who trump that. And the one law that trumps making the vow is you don't do human sacrifice. You don't do that. So what he should have done, as we'll see, is he says, okay, I understand what I said, but there is a greater law that says we do not do this as Israelites. So in the place of that, let me offer a sacrifice fitting the Mosaic law. Here in a little bit, I'll actually show you the verses. This is an example where he should have broken the vow. When Hannah made the vow, she had to offer him as a Nazirite, because that was her vow. When Miriam made a vow, she had to do her thing. When David made a vow, like they fulfilled those vows. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. In the Sermon on the Mount, the issue is oath-taking. And Jesus is criticizing them, saying that you will swear by this because you think, well, now I don't have to keep my vow. And Jesus says, no. You got to keep your vow. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. But this is an example where you can't do that. Actually, let's look at verse 37. I'll show you in Leviticus. It says, so she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions. Now, it's worth noting the ignorance of not just the daughter, but of Jephthah in addressing the annulment of a vow. So let me show you. These are my notes. So I didn't actually put Leviticus, the verses. But it regulates in a number of ways. It's a bit wonky. It's in this situation, it's going to cost you this amount. But if you take her age, she's a maiden, so about a teenager or younger, so say between 10 and 14, something like that, probably. The cost of annulling the vow is 20 shekels, and that is to go to a priest. So he is to come to a priest and say, I made this vow, and because of how it worked out, I can't sacrifice my daughter. That violates the law of Moses. So here is 20 shekels. Let me additionally offer to you these other sacrifices, which are keeping with the intention of the vow. But they never bring that up, which tells you they're ignorant of the Mosaic law. So remember, these are the people of God in the land of God, and you have an entire generation ignorant of the law of God. This is the tragic story of Judges. And the miracle of the story of Jephthah is not how wicked they are, but that despite their wickedness, God still delivers them. It shows us the depth of God's unconditioned love. That's the whole point of the story, even though we do have to talk about these different things. So what she does request is say, okay, give me 2 months to spend time with my friends. Now she says, weep for my virginity. What she means here is her desire to be a mother, raise a family, and enjoy marriage. So she is robbed of God's good creative order. Now here's the irony. The story begins with Jephthah, is his mother is a prostitute, and she was given the opportunity to be a mother. His daughter did not. So he ought to understand what can happen, how men can victimize women, and yet he never seemed to have learned the lesson. And it just heightens the tragedy of it all. Now, what's interesting here is she wants to spend time with her friends, but not her family. Why didn't she say, can we just for 2 months, you take off work, let's go to the beach, or let's go to our vacation spot, whatever it is. For 2 months, let's just spend time together. I mean, that's what I'm doing. If I get a diagnosis that says you got 6 weeks before you die, okay, I'm retiring, and I'm going to spend 6 weeks with my family. Don't come bother me. I love you guys, not that much, okay? It's just I want to spend time with them, But she wants to go spend it with her friends. And notice the irony again. Jephthah is exiled by his brothers, but his daughter chooses a type of exile from her own father. It's just so tragic. And then we go down to verse 38. So he said, go. Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed, she and her companions, and wept for her virginity on the mountains. And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. Now, that phrase is where all the debate is, because it doesn't say he sacrificed her. Therefore, those who don't like the idea will say, therefore, he didn't sacrifice her. And there's good arguments on the other side, and that's fine. But what is striking to me is how brief this part of the story is. We get more details about the mountains she's going to spend time with her friends than the actual climax of this part of the story. The climax is the sacrifice. And it is is it 7 words in the Hebrew? It's 5 words in the Hebrew. In English, it's he did to her his vow which he had vowed. In Hebrew, it's 5 words. I mean, the narrator, it just, you know where this is going, let's move on. And I think the tone of the narrator is one of grief. Let me read to you Daniel Block, the commentator I read earlier. The contrast with the description of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac could scarcely be starker, but there is more. Whereas Abraham's sacrifice of his son assured him of a hope and a future, Jephthah's sacrifice of his daughter robbed him of both a hope and a future. The conquering hero is reduced to nothing. Wow, that's so insightful. I just love that. So let's finish it out here. The rest of verse 39. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. Now, we don't have any other reference to this historically in the Bible or outside of the Bible. This is probably a local custom. It may have lasted a few generations, but we just don't know. You're not going to find this that I'm aware of. They're not doing this in the days of Jesus, for example. Certainly not doing it now. Now, it is worth noting that the daughter is memorialized in the text. Jephthah is not. In fact, in chapter 12, verse 7, it's the next page over in my Bible. Here's the death of Jephthah. Jephthah judged Israel 6 years. I believe this is the shortest thus far of all the judges. A lot of them are 40 years, 20 years. This is 6 years. By the way, notice it's 6. It's the number of man. It's not 7. It's not 10. It certainly isn't 40. 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in his city in Gilead. That's all you get. He served 6 years and he died. They put him in the ground. What does his daughter get? She died, and she was memorialized. And every year, they spend 4 days mourning her loss. What a contrast. Again, I think there's a tone from the narrator worth noticing here. So let's do this. Let's look at the most prominent alternative theory to what we've offered here, that she is sacrificed. There is one, but let's begin here I think the natural reading of the text is that he goes through the sacrifice. So that's my conclusion. Now, when it comes to the Bible does mess with this. There's a natural reading, and then as more you read the text, you start to think, well, maybe there's this other way to view it. And I think this is a good example of it. You can make a good argument that he doesn't do it, but I'm not sure it's consistent. Let me share with you where I struggle with this conclusion. Now, it is my conclusion in reading the text. At the same time, I am uncomfortable with that conclusion. And I think that's the tension we're supposed to find in reading the story. So let me give you 2 reasons why I struggle with that conclusion. One is in verse 29 of chapter 11, we are told that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. Now, we looked at this last week. Here are 3 examples of the same phrase attached to Othniel, Gideon, and Samson. Now, it is worth noting that phrase does show up in the Bible attached to not so righteous people. I think Barak is one, not Barak, Balaam, I think is one in Numbers that comes to mind. There's others. So it's not always that it's David slaying Goliath. It's always the heroes. Sometimes it's not as righteous people. The idea is that a special moment of influence and power and grace is shown upon this individual to achieve something that is God's end. However, when you read, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and a few verses later, he makes a foolish vow, and a few verses later, he offers a sacrifice. My initial reading is, that's a hard pill to swallow. But let me give you one that's more difficult for me. How is Jephthah treated elsewhere in the Bible? He's treated as a hero. And this is where I struggle. So the number one passage, I bet Danny, you know where I'm going with this. It is the book of Hebrews. Hebrews 11 is the faith chapter. So you get Abel, you get Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and David, Moses. You get heroes. But then at the end, he starts to run out of space. So it starts out with, what more shall I say? We could talk about Gideon. We could talk about Barak. Remember with Deborah. We could talk about Samson. We could talk about Jephthah. All 4 of these are judges. And it's worth noting, all of these guys, Barak, kind of soft, but discounting Barak, these guys aren't very good people. I mean, Gideon goes pagan there at the end. And he makes himself a priest. I mean, he makes his own idols. I mean, he's not good. Samson, my goodness, where do we begin? Well, we will in a few weeks, actually, Lord willing. And then there's Jephthah. And then he goes, of David and Samuel and the prophets. And then he then details some of what they shut the mouth of lions, they conquered kingdoms, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
None of them guys are really good.
Yeah. So,
Just like us.
right. Now, we could take almost every major character in the Bible and say, I see the great that they did, men and women of faith, but then you can just as easily say, let's talk about this scene. And we're doing that with Jephthah, although we could do the whole story of Jephthah. And we're not done with Jephthah. He's still got to call civil war. That's next time. So I'll be honest with you. I'm having a hard time seeing him as among the heroes of the Bible. So there is a part of me that would say, is there an alternative theory that can make me feel more comfortable? So there is one. And the idea here, let me give you one more. He shows up again in 1 Samuel. The Lord sent Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, and Barak, and Jephthah, and Samuel. See the connection to Hebrews 11? They're the same names, pretty much in that order. And delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety. So it's very similar to Hebrews. It's just a passing reference to them. So what is the main alternative theory? And the theory goes, Jephthah didn't offer her as a sacrifice. He gave her over to a life of celibacy in the tabernacle, but more likely a pagan shrine. And so the reason you would conclude that, and right, others conclude it, one, they don't like the idea of Jephthah doing this. It's appalling. But the main reason is the emphasis on her virginity. So she talks about how she's not going to be a mom, she's going to be a virgin, and then her friends mourn her virginity. They don't mourn she's going to die. But again, I'm not convinced of that, because the point is to grieve that the creation order has been robbed because Jephthah is a wicked pagan. This concept of the creation order is gone when you don't know the books of Moses, you know? And so what we see then is the tragic end of Jephthah's family. In one sense, God blessed Jephthah, giving him victory, but he cursed Jephthah because of, you know, things like this. In fact, he can defeat the Ammonites, but then he has to go to war with his own people. And so I don't hold to this, but it is a very prominent conclusion people do draw. And I've got commentaries in my office right now who make this argument rather forcefully. Now, let me just say, in the story, it's evident that Jephthah is not completely ignorant of the Bible. If we had time, we can go back and look at it in chapter 11, when he debates the Ammonite king in diplomacy, right? They go out to battle and says, okay, before we do this, why are you trying to kill us? And he makes his argument. He goes, well, you're getting your history wrong, okay? This is what we did. This is what our ancestors did. Here's the reality. He clearly has a knowledge of Jewish history. He seems ignorant of the Jewish law. I think he's pretty pagan. Okay, so let's do this. What is the point of this? Okay, a couple points. Stick with me. Somber stories leave us deep in thought. I'm willing to bet you've gone to the movies or even watched it at your house, and there are some movies, their basic function is to entertain, and they have no other function whatsoever. You are just not in the world watching Jim Carrey make funny faces. And then you move on with your life. There are those stories, right? And they serve a perfectly fine purpose. Sometimes you need to laugh. Sometimes you need a love story. Sometimes you just need to see a hero being heroic. That's fine. Then there are other movies you watch. And you walk out of the theater like, what did I just... like, okay, I got to replay that in my head. I need to think, you know. And this is one of those stories. It's why we don't talk about it in Sunday school. Right? You got little kids, Noah built an ark because God saved people. Isn't that great? And he loves animals. Don't you love animals? Those are great. You're not doing Jephthah in Sunday school. Okay? Because it forces us to think and to wonder, what's going on here? Why is this in the Bible? We can just skip this. So, although we prefer stories of righteous heroes doing righteous things, they rarely stick with us. You can go and watch every Mission Impossible movie. I started Jason Bourne Identity, and my family didn't want to watch the rest, so I had to watch by myself. So just rewatch them all again. They are mind-numbing action movies with a thin of a plot, you know. But then, and it was just the hero does heroic things. But what we get here is initially we're rooting for him because he's a victim. He's a victim of his family casting him out. He didn't choose who his parents were. And so he's cast out, but before long we start to think, he's not a hero. I'm having a hard time rooting for him. He's anti-heroic, and then we get to this part of the story and we think, he's the villain. I've been told in reading Judges I should root for the heroes of Israel and against their enemies, but I see the enemy in him. So we're stuck here like, okay, what do I do with that? I'm reading the Bible. What do I do with that? Let me give you just three things to take home with you. First one is we need to meditate upon the text. What we prefer is to read stories in the Bible. They make sense to us initially, and we move on with our lives. Right? That's what we want. Jesus healed the sick lady. We should love sick ladies too. You don't have to think about that much. Jesus died for our sins. There he is. Father, forgive them for they know not what to do. Man, that's easy. Boy, I mean, that'll preach without much thought. Sometimes, look, the Bible is at its core meditation literature. It's meant to be read and reread and reread and reread. And the more you read it, the more you're going to see things. And this is actually where I fall in love with the Bible, is when I've read a story 1,000 times, and on the 1,001 first time, I now start to see the depth that's there. It just takes time to get there. And this is why we read it as a community of believers. What is worth noting is the story of Jephthah is not unique in history. Because we read this and we are rightly appalled because we have to ask ourselves, how can a society and how can an individual get to the point where they would sacrifice their own children for their own benefits? And when we ask that question, the text forces us to ask, we start to realize, oh no, we're doing it now. We're doing it now. There was a story years ago where a mass grave was uncovered. It was all over the news. Skulls of children, babies, only to discover, no, it was the dumping ground of a Planned Parenthood. Of a Planned Parenthood. Dumping ground of a Planned Parenthood. I guess those were the bodies they couldn't sell. How many of us right now, even beyond that bloody, awful wickedness, how many of us right now, how many of our families, we will sacrifice our children for wealth and a career? I tell you what, get you a young couple who are about to be married. Pick any of them in the city right now. Pick any of them. They are 22 well, now it's like 29 years old, whatever it is. And you say to them, the best thing for your marriage, the best thing when you get pregnant is for her to quit her job, prioritize the family, and watch what the reaction is. How many parents right now are telling their teenage kids, your priority is your career over children, money over marriage? We're doing that right now. Can I give you better advice? Get married young as you can legally, okay? All right? And because you need to learn to live off love, and you need to learn that this marriage is the priority of everything we do. And everything good that comes our way is going to be a result of our love for one another. That's basic Christianity, but we are willing to sacrifice the people we claim to love for personal benefits. I mean, we're forced to ask ourselves this. How many children right now are in single homes? Daddy is nothing more than a monthly check. How many right now have been sacrificed? Yeah. Yeah, so when we meditate upon the text, we are appalled because we think, well, that's ancient paganism. But the more we read it, the more we look in the mirror, we realize there's a little bit of Jephthah in me today. A little bit of Jephthah in me. I'm an ambitious, somewhat workaholic, and at times I have to stop and think, am I sacrificing the well-being of my wife and kids or the other people I love for whatever reason, even if I cloud it in nobleness and righteousness? But a society that abandons the Lord will make victims of innocent children and women, as we said. Secondly, biblical ignorance has dire consequences. I believe the Bible is the revelation of wisdom, and when it is abandoned, foolishness will be the rule of the day. So it should not take a person with a PhD in philosophy, ethics, morality, and the history of religion to understand there is no circumstances by which killing children and young people is good for society. Are we asking too much? However, when you abandon the Lord, it is easy to rationalize what ought to be irrational. The things that we will do to each other for our own personal benefit. You ruined this. It's your fault, he says. Who's the most important person in Jephthah's life? It's him. It's him, rather than his daughter, who's now the victim of his paganism. Now, he should know his Bible. As we said, the Bible makes it clear. It condemns human sacrifice. Right? And that's part of what makes the cross so appalling. It's human sacrifice. And it's the Romans and the Jewish leaders who are involved in that. It is appalling what happens there. Yeah, and yeah. Now, yeah. So what you'll find is people will try to. Right. So now, when it comes to some of those issues, that would be a rabbit we could chase, but at a later time. But we should think more seriously about this idea of planning a family, if that makes sense. I do think it's a conversation we need to have as Christians. Right. But that is normal. So I bet if you took that young couple, I bet they'll give you, we're going to have 1.5 kids is like the average now. We're going to have 2 kids. It's a Far Side cartoon, by the way. It's a Far Side cartoon. He has 1.5 kids. So we're going to have one child, two children. They're going to be 2 years apart, and I'm going to, all that sort of stuff. We do that. Yeah. Yeah. Let me add just one more point under here, and that is that one of the challenges we have as humans is the mixing of biblical fidelity with cultural assumptions. We often assume that because of a cultural tradition, assumption, whatever, it is therefore biblical. We do this as Americans. You've heard me complain that often we think more as American evangelicals than we do as evangelicals. That there are certain presumptions we have as Christians that reflect American culture more than the Bible. I'll give you one that's looking right in the mirror. The professionalization of ministers is one. But that'll give me enough trouble. Here's the last thing. And that's been something that's been on my heart and mind. I was told growing up, you cannot preach unless you have a master's degree. That was just the expectation. Now, I became a youth minister right out of high school. And I went to Boyce because I wanted to preach. And that was my compromise. But I was told, you got to have a master's. You got to have it. One of the issues we have with Dylan is he's told, well, you got to go to seminary and tell people about Jesus in Panama. And so I remember working with him and some of our leadership in the KBC and saying, what is he's not going to do that. And he shouldn't have to wait 5 years, because he's not going to go full time as a student. What can we do to get him on the field, tell people about Jesus right now? And that's one of the reasons why he's doing the journeyman thing. He's going to do some seminary stuff, but he's got it worked out to where he can still go back, right? And that is a bit of a frustrating thing I don't want to chase that rabbit. Here's the last thing. God cannot be manipulated. By buying into pagan theology, and this is paganism, Jephthah has convinced himself, because this is the culture of Canaanite religion, is that if you want the gods to do something for you, you got to bribe them. So he thinks, well, that's the way the Jewish God is. Because the Egyptian gods are like that, the Assyrian gods are like that, the Ammonite gods are like that, the Canaanite gods are like that. All the gods are like that. So the Jewish God is like that. So I've got to bribe them. Well, we're outnumbered. They've been preparing for battle. I've got a few rednecks, with rifles, deer rifles, and I need to win. So I tell you what, I'll bust out the big guns. I'll give you my daughter. It's manipulation. But what's noteworthy here? Remember, the big point of the story is to say, is there a moment when God will abandon His people? Is that possible? And in chapter 10, it sounds like He will. But in chapter 11, He proves otherwise. On at least 2 occasions I found, God makes it clear He will deliver His people. Let me put them up here. Chapter 10, verse 16. So they put away the foreign gods from among them and served the Lord. And He became impatient over the misery of Israel, which is a way of saying God hears their repentance. He sees it. He will respond by delivering them, because that's been the pattern of Judges. God's become impatient with their misery. God's about to show up. And God can use crooked people for His purposes. That's the amazing thing about God. And then we've talked about this. The Spirit of the Lord has come upon Jephthah. And that but it comes before his vow. So Jephthah doesn't realize that God's grace is not something you need to bribe him out of. Yet, that is precisely the message of religion. Religion is, I will do this, you do that. I will walk the aisle. I will get baptized. I'll eat the breadcrumbs and the grapes, grape juice, Welch's, of course, and nothing else, because Jesus would not approve. I will go to camp. I'll show up to church. I'll read my Bible. I'll say my prayers. I'll hold on to my rosary. I'll do the things of religion. So I'll do all these things, and what God will do is meet whatever expectations I have of Him. Make me wealthy, make me happy, fix my family, solve my problems, get rid of my anxiety, whatever it is. And what we're doing is we are trying to manipulate God to serve us rather than see grace as an opportunity by which we serve Him. So what we have here is a fundamental rejection of the gospel, and it forces us to realize this is still going on. Maybe not at the cost of sacrificing our children, but certainly at the cost of forsaking the sacrifice of Jesus. Oh, yeah. Religion is not the gospel. Yeah. So, Yeah, so the good news of the gospel is that God does not require the sacrifice of others. He accepts only the sacrifice of his Son. And so here we see the tragic story of a life taken, but in Christ we see the beautiful story of a life given. And it's true that God sends his Son to be a sacrifice. Christ lays his life down to be a sacrifice. So in Jesus, we see the ugliness of Jephthah and his daughter. It is horrific. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is awful. It is ugly upon a cross, which is the epitome of injustice and violence and hate. Yet, through the beauty of the gospel, we hang crosses all over our walls, and we have one right behind us right now. Why is that? Because through the cross, God overcame the peak of human evil and wickedness. It is a mystery beyond all mysteries. It's a greater mystery than this passage. But here is vital that we see Jesus in all of his glory. And what changes it all is that Christ conquered the grave. You see, here, her friends and generations later, they can only come and memorialize and mourn her great loss. But we don't go to an empty tomb. There's not a body there. Together we proclaim, death has been conquered, the serpent's head has been crushed, Christ lives forevermore. He is risen indeed. So I don't understand this passage. I don't. And I don't like this passage. I wish it wasn't there, frankly. But it is worth pausing and meditating that there's a better story that should draw our attention. And that is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Danny, we miss anything?
Well, I'd like to put 2 cents worth.
Yeah, go for it.
Here in verse 29, it says that and she came back and he did with her as he vowed. And then it says there, she knew no man.
Yeah.
Now that's ambiguous.
Yeah. So it is a re-emphasizing the virginity line. So those who deny that she was sacrificed will say, well, there it is.
It makes sense either way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think the writer's appalled that he's having to tell this story. But you can kind of understand why he does tell the story. You can't tell Noah about the drunkenness because it's a retelling of the Garden of Eden.
I tend to agree with the Bible.
Yeah. So those who make that argument, they make a fine exegetical argument straight from the Bible. They're not making it up. I'm just not sure that is the conclusion. Don, what'd you have?
One thing on that is, I read a commentary earlier that she ended up being a temple harlot.
Yeah, so that's another thing that gets skipped. So what I said was, most say, well, she's dedicated to the tabernacle. I see nothing in Jephthah that would suggest she would be sent to the Jewish tabernacle. Even if she is, it's probably paganized by now.
But also, Jephthah should have never been in that place to begin with. God didn't raise him up. He said, I'll do this.
Yeah.
So he should have never been in that place. So God did use him, but he was doing it all for himself.
Yeah. Jephthah failed to understand that if God calls, God equips. Yeah, the other Don.
You just got through saying, so God sent, and he lists those names, and Jephthah's in there.
Yeah. God did send Jephthah. Yeah.
He sent David, he sent a whole bunch of people, and none of them were written perfect.
No.
The other thing that bothered me was the family that rejected him because he was born of a harlot. They would have nothing to do with him, even though they had the same father. So how did that weigh into his attitude and behavior and a whole bunch of stuff?
Well, I don't know about his attitude and stuff, but in the narrative, it draws a contrast. Here's a man who was cast out by his family, but here's a man who then turns around and executes his family. It makes his decision far worse, because he should understand, I have all these brothers and they abandoned me. God's only given me one daughter. He should be more protective of her. It's his daughter. I got a little girl. You ain't messing with her. I think it heightens that narrative even more, of the tragedy. It is an awful story. But again, we turn on the news.
He sent him to save a people that was as bad or worse than he was.
Yeah. So you're right. He's called to defeat the pagans while they themselves are pagans. So now let's meditate upon God's love. Even at our worst, God's love is still available to us. And if you can get to that conclusion in this story, you can turn it around in your own life and say, I see myself in Jephthah, David, Samson, all of them. I see that. But isn't it good news to conclude even that hasn't surpassed the depth of God's love. You cannot sink below God's love. Now, we don't have to understand that. And we certainly have a hard time practicing it towards other people. But that fundamental truth is central to the Bible.
Jonah's my hero and Drake's better.
Yeah. It's a
So that was the only child?
as far as we know, the only child of the harlots. But it's his half brothers who cast him out.
The holy guys.
Yeah. And in that culture, who your parents are, your family line determines everything. Well, I mean, a king and queen is basically chosen. When Henry VIII had all those kids from different women, the question is who's the right queen, and it becomes a problem. It becomes a real problem. Yeah.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
What's your name again?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to butt in.
Yeah.
It comes to my mind when you guys are
I'm
talking.
saying that Solomon goes into the room and says, "Now, what's your name again?"
That's what he's going to say. Yeah.
Numbers on
And remember, the story of Jephthah being the son of a harlot mirrors the story of Hagar and Ishmael. So he is the son of a servant girl. It's a concubine. It's a sex slave. And then when the true son comes, they cast them out of the family. That story is repeated in Jephthah. Now, God had a redeeming plan, somewhat of a redeeming plan for the Ishmaelites. And that's where the Arabs and Jews are now fighting. But a lot of parallels here. I know it's late. I appreciate y'all's patience. You guys have been very patient. Let me remind you, we won't be here Sunday. We got some stuff at Capital Commission in California. Pray that